I was just severely depressed, and I had managed to get my hands on Vyvanse, which was like the new Adderall to control my weight. But that medication made me even more severely suicidal. And it was like a perfect storm. I went to New York for school, and it was like Good Girls Gone Wild. It wasn't like a normal college campus. It's just like I was let loose out on the city in fashion school and had access to best friends who just had unlimited amounts of drugs. And like the culture was just like, go out, get blasted. Like I was probably drinking to blackout and doing drugs like every other day.
My first thoughts of suicide, I was 11 years old. I think if I had kept going the way I was going, I would be dead.
I didn't fully understand where mental health conditions until I went to high school and I started to learn a little more about depression and anxiety. And that's when I realized, oh, I have depression and anxiety.
I was in this really disgusting bathroom at 5 a.m. smoking meth. And I had this part of me that would say, it's not really a problem if people are around while you're doing it. I'm just like a social crystal meth smoker. And I was very like, I don't want to make changes. You're the problem. He's the problem. The relationship's the problem. I'm not the problem. Oh, I was the problem. The problem was me.
Welcome to the I Decide Darlings podcast. I'm Erin.
And I'm Lisa. We are moms, wives, best friends, entrepreneurs, and authors of the book, I Decide, the happy little guide to living your best life. Pull up a chair, grab a glass of wine, and get ready to talk all things health, success, loss, money, family, and everything in between. These two besties won't leave anything off the table.
So get ready to laugh, cry, hear the tips, tools, and stories to give you the success you crave, the life you adore, and the future you deserve. You are listening to the I Decide podcast.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the I Decide Darlings podcast. Erin Lopez.
And Lisa Cox, hello.
We would love to know who Tammy is and take us back to a little bit of your journey and where you are then and where you are today.
Yeah. So it's funny because I can't really talk about where I am now without talking about just really personal parts of my upbringing. And I never thought that having that out in the open would be part of my resume, but here we are. So I grew up, I'm first generation to immigrant parents who are from Hong Kong. And I grew up in an alcoholic household. My dad was an alcoholic, and a lot of my childhood was spent kind of managing that. And, when my parents moved from New York to Houston in order to establish a better, hopefully more successful life, my mom started working full time selling furniture. And so I was tasked sort of with the responsibility of, in my 4-year-old mind, making sure my dad didn't drink so he wouldn't die.
Mm-hmm.
And so thus began this like internal struggle of feeling like I was taking care of him or watching him at all times. And then also holding on to this really huge tension within my body of, well, he's also lying to me. He's telling me he's drinking apple juice when it's beer. And do I tell mom? Because if I tell mom, then she's going to divorce him. And then if she divorces him, then I've heard that he's going to die. So then my struggle as a 4-year-old is like, do I hold the responsibility of saving his life, or do I hold the responsibility of, being loyal to my mom? And I also share a lot about my relationship with my mom growing up as well, which was not easy, just from everyone's trauma being passed on and perpetuated and it not being conscious. So I really feel, and I love my parents, even if I'm taking some space right now. It's so messy and it's complicated for everybody, these dynamics. And yeah, my path from that, and then, being bulimic for 10 years, like just severely depressed, anxious, going into countless disastrous relationships and experiencing quite a bit of sexual trauma and overcoming all of that to finally be able to have a voice and to help other women has been my journey. And now I find myself really like my work has evolved even more from that intro where it's, um, I'm a somatic experiencing practitioner as well as a
Mhm.
body temple dance facilitator and kind of helping people find like the holy trinity of attachment, which is secure attachment with ourselves, with God, and others. When I say God, I mean the universe, spirit, goddess, whatever spirituality is to you. And with like a huge focus on attachment trauma, because
Mhm.
for where we are now in our generation, that's what a lot of us experienced. And not that it wasn't part of it, but not as much of, say, like the survival trauma that my parents experienced, but more of this like covert relational stuff that, we can't really make sense of when we're
Mhm.
kids.
I have the hardest time hearing 4 years old. I know you probably saying that is still probably something that's hard to talk about because when I think about a 4-year-old, I first of all, I don't really have memories of being 4. I
Mhm.
don't,
Mm,
and you had not only memories, but you have trauma and you had so much responsibility given to you at
yeah,
4 years old, and that's what makes me as a, with my mom's heart. My daughters are grown, but that really hurts to
yeah.
hear you
Mhm.
as
Thank
a
you.
beautiful young woman say that it started at 4.
Did everyone else, because like you said, your mom thought you were this perfect child without any problems, not problems, but did the rest of everybody else around you think that of your family probably? Like did they know that he had a drinking issue or that you had this, we always say you never know what's happening
Mhm.
inside their home. Were
Right.
you were you all the perfect trio?
Yeah, it seemed like that, and that seems like such like, I just had a conversation with somebody about that recently of, like, how
Mhm.
harmful it is that we just try to portray this perfect family
Mhm.
image, and that's so much of the pain. So yeah, I think it was hard because when we were with my friends or we were out, like, it was fun and, festive and, um, you know, people knew that my dad was an alcoholic, but my mom would always say, if the waiter was offering a drink or something, or, she would say, "Oh, no, he's an alcoholic. Once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic," because that was the
Mm.
rhetoric back then about
Mhm.
alcoholism without tracing it back to trauma as the root.
Mhm.
And so it was this like facade of like, "Oh, he used to drink and we have no problems," or yeah, but then behind closed doors, it was an
Mhm.
ongoing issue.
Mhm.
Mhm. So walk us through because what you've been through is in my heart goes out to you and we're grateful that you're here with us because I do think that there's beauty in you sharing your mess as your message,
Mhm.
because we're not alone in this. But take us to that moment where maybe you finally decided that enough was enough or how did you get to the point because you're doing amazing work now?
Mhm.
What was that turning point for you?
Like when I started sharing.
Or when did you say, I have a problem or bulimia, or I
Mm,
know that drugs and alcohol were
okay.
probably a part of it. So was there a
Yeah.
moment, and again, there was probably many,
Yeah.
but a moment that stands out to you that you say like, I could go right or I could go left, but I'm gonna go right.
Yeah, after I left Houston, I went to New York for school, and it was like Good Girls Gone Wild, and,
Mhm.
it wasn't like a normal college campus. It's just like I was let loose out on the city in fashion school and had access to best friends who just, like, had unlimited amounts of drugs, and, like, the culture was just, like, go out, get blasted. Like, I was probably drinking to blackout and doing drugs, like, every other day.
Mhm.
And, yeah, just, like, being very promiscuous and using my bodies in ways to try and receive love, and it was
Mhm.
like this never-ending cycle, and I was probably smoking a pack of cigarettes a day,
Mhm.
and, still my eating disorder was going on, and I think that it wasn't as much of a decision as much as, like, the body speaking to me, which happens to so many people, when I just hit a wall, and there was, like, a certain point that my stomach couldn't even hold food down, and it just, like, bloated, like, distended to, like, 4 times the size and just stayed that way, And my aunt, who's a nurse, she was afraid that I had stomach cancer,
Mm.
and I was just severely depressed, and I had managed to get my hands on Vyvanse, which was like the new Adderall, to control my weight, but that medication made me even more severely suicidal, and
Mm.
it was like a perfect storm, and I started developing, ulcer symptoms and finally went to the doctor,
Mm.
and, this is one of those moments that I'm just like, I know that spirit is guiding me because I didn't have really good experiences with Western doctors who told me that my bloating was normal and like all of these symptoms were normal. But I actually ended up in Victoria Albina's office. And at the time, she was a nurse practitioner who was working as a PCP, and she was starting to get into holistic medicine. And so she was the first person, I go in, I'm like, just heal my ulcer symptoms, give me pills or whatever, and she was the first person to ask me, what is your relationship like to your father? And there I am, like 21, like shaking in the doctor's office, like, why are you asking me this? Like, nobody has ever asked me this. And what does that have to do with this? And it's funny because she actually does very similar what I do now. She also does somatic coaching and attachment and healing codependency.
Mhm.
And she put me on this protocol, and, I couldn't drink anymore. I couldn't, do all these things that were consuming probably 70% of my time.
Mm.
And, and I also started working with an acupuncture, traditional Chinese medicine doctor. And it was this time that felt really disempowering at the time because I'm like, oh, poor me. I can't do drugs. I can't go out anymore. I have to like make all these weird, crazy meals out of like cassava root. And I didn't even know how to
Mhm.
cook. And, it was like, it felt at the time like very like, poor me. Like, why is this happening to me? And because it was isolating too, because my social scene was partying. And in that time period, I guess, then I turned to, Gabrielle Bernstein, is that her name?
Mhm.
I read Spirit Junkie and
Mhm.
then Eckhart Tolle, The Power of Now, and
Mhm.
so I was going through this, like, awakening process, and, like, living in Brooklyn, New York, where I started to, like, look at trees and start to sense that there was spirit
Mhm.
in there and freaking out, but at the same time still being my, like, depressed, like, spiraling self, and, so I guess that was the turn, and I really
Mhm.
appreciate running into Victoria at that time in my life.
I'm assuming you probably didn't talk about feelings and all of that in your household that, fast forward now and, in your household one day, it's like we overshare in the Lopez household, we overshare. But hearing you talk about like the body sensations, I mean, I think it's so important for all of us, the children and the adults, to understand. And I'm thinking now of ways that we just our body is telling us something that
Mhm,
you're allowing us to have the voice now to say, wait, this is giving me anxiety right now. So
mhm.
what can I do about it? So I love that you're sharing that. And am I right? You probably did not talk about your feelings in your household.
No,
Yeah.
I didn't talk unless it would,
Really?
contribute or be helpful. Yeah, and then when you say that, it just brings me back to, like, actually, parenting, because I have been in my own spiral of, like, "How will I be a mom? Like, I won't get it right in all these ways." But then so many experts talk about how I think it's like some strangely low percentage, like you only have to get it right 20% of the time or something like that, and it
Yeah.
was, like, more about the rupture and repair process
Mhm.
rather
Mhm.
than just needing to do it all right.
Mhm.
Mhm.
You're gonna be an amazing mama for these
Yeah.
reasons,
Aw.
you
Yeah, you
really
are.
will, and it is so stressful being a mom because thinking, "What is my daughter gonna say when she's my age," of what I
Right.
did, but but I also think that we learn so much from our own childhoods that when
Mm,
you, Tammy, become a mom, you're going to be oversharing and you're going to be over every aspect of it because of what you've been through. That
Right.
you're, we call it the circle of trust in our household, that when we sit down at our kitchen table, anything goes,
Oh, I love
because
that.
we don't want, but you're going to be a great mama. We know
Thank
that. We can say
you.
that. Yeah. Yeah.
That sounds like such a safe space to be in.
Mhm.
Oh, and crazy and fun all at the same time.
Mhm.
How is your relationship with your parents now?
Currently, as of last March, I'm on a little bit of a separating break just because my dog Nala died in January, and it was
Oh.
a quite a traumatic experience. And yeah, I think they tried to be helpful in the ways they could, but it did end up in a bit of a blowout where words were exchanged that just were like daggers all over again. And I think with Nala dying, and yeah, it feels strange to say that she felt like my daughter or she felt like my soulmate
Mhm.
and my like number one secure attachment partner. Like I live on 10 acres of land by myself. Like she is my best friend.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
Yeah,
I get that.
um
we get that. Don't worry.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And so in that process, there's something about death or catastrophe like that that really made it clear to me what I will and will not tolerate anymore in relationships. And it made it really clear for me to be able to say no, like I will not take this anymore. Um,
Mhm.
and it wasn't like I don't want to talk to you again. It was more just I will not engage in relating in these ways. And you can come to me if you feel lonely in these ways,
Mhm.
but it's been complicated. And I think maybe, you know, growing up, my mom's favorite thing was stonewalling for like 3 weeks at a time, and we've talked about it, and for her, she was just like, I didn't want to say something I would regret, and for me, I was like tiptoeing around the house, like just running out to get meals for 3 weeks at a time, like terrified. And so I have been in the process of kind of like working with those somatic memories, right? Of
Mhm.
like, oh, we just had a blowout, and of course she's going to ignore me, and I'm really tired of doing all the work right now.
Mhm.
But I think right now has been time and space for me to like feel like the terror in my body and like the repetitive thought loops of feeling insufficient, unworthy, invisible. Did I say invisible? um, um, like in the ways that really affected me and the ways that it's showing up in my work and my relationships now. So I wouldn't say it's on bad terms, but I think like just due to the nature of her not knowing how to reach out, or maybe her
Mhm.
intentions right now are to give me space.
Mhm.
We haven't spoken
Mm.
for a lot of this year.
You're on a little break.
Mhm. We're on a break,
You're on a break.
and I expect, at some point it'll
Mhm.
reconvene and I'll feel built up in a way that I have the resources to not
Mhm.
feel just dragged into all
Mhm.
of the history.
So you were a hot mess. Tell us a little bit more about that. Like you had some crazy times that brought you to some really big good times. How did that happen?
So I think for a lot of people, if you, and well, trauma is sort of like it makes me cringe when I hear that word now because it's become the Insta social media buzzword where now everything is trauma. So like I don't like the way you just drank your coffee, so you're traumatizing and triggering me, to like abuse. It's just a word that has become it now. It means everything, so it means nothing. But I think for a lot of people, I grew up in a situation that didn't look like trauma. So I didn't know until I was almost 30 that, having no boundaries and distorted parent child roles and being in a house where everyone screamed all the time or stonewalled or gaslit, that was just my normal. And so I would never have said that's not trauma. Like I was never in a war. Up until a point I would have set trigger warning for people listening. Like I have assault trauma, but at the time I didn't have like any type of body injury trauma. So I wouldn't have said I have trauma. It's just like, doesn't everybody's family do this? And then as I got into relationships that were increasingly more and more toxic, and then violence, and then adding drugs to that mix, it became evident pretty clear that like I'm not okay. I'm like really not okay. And I thought it was just me. I just thought I am the problem. My brain doesn't brain. I just got sent out of the human factory missing all the software and I couldn't figure it out. And so I keep things really real now because life is complicated, but the healing processes shouldn't be. And using all these big clinical la-di-da words, it shouldn't be like that. It should be, you have a brain, here's driver's ed for the brain, so you can know what you're driving. Like when I was 16, I learned to drive a car and I sucked at it, but I was able to maneuver around. And when I learned the equivalent for my own brain, I started to realize, oh, this makes sense. And in all my time as a clinician, I have never seen symptoms not make sense in context. So, like, I might not understand why the guy on the street is experiencing what he's going through, but up close, everyone makes sense. And that's incredibly, well, it's good news and it's bad news, because then the burden was on me to make some changes. And I was very like, I don't want to make changes. You're the problem. He's the problem. The relationship's the problem. I'm not the problem. Oh, I was the problem. The problem was me. And that's great news, because if the problem is me, I'm empowered to do something about it. And so I did.
How did you take all those feelings you just shared and all those experience and everything, and then put it into, a couple incredible books and experiences that are now serving people?
Yeah, I like my I decides more now. Like, I'm going to decide to write a book, and that was a great decision and a hard one, and it changed a lot of things. And I'm going to decide to become an aerial circus performer at the age of 37 after a 20-year chemical habit and shenanigans, and I was able to do that. It really, and this is so infuriating, and I really hate that this was the solution, but it came down to, I call them micro yeses, like steps that are so small that they can't even qualify as a baby step. And I'll give you an example. So when I had my in the bathroom, oh my gosh, I have a problem kind of moment, I made a phone call to a friend, and I'm like, and I have trauma, and I've been lying to everybody, and I've got all this stuff. What am I going to do? And she's like, Britt, when was the last time you ate anything? And I was like, oh, wait, I need to eat something. I haven't eaten in days. I haven't showered or slept in days. It was a hot mess. That is a micro yes. And big lives are built on the back of tiny micro yeses. And everyone gets really annoyed when I talk about them. Like, that's dumb. I know it's silly, but it's science. The reason
I love it.
I don't think it's dumb.
No.
I like it.
Thank you. Okay, I appreciate that. But it sounds frustrating. It's like, well, how much, like a baby step for a fitness goal would be take a walk around the block after work. And everyone's like, how am I supposed to get anything done if I'm taking steps that are that small, microscopic small, micro yes? Well, the pace you start at is not the pace you stay at. Micro yeses get you from the state of inertia where I feel stuck to now I'm building momentum in the direction that I want to go.
And don't you think like these micro yeses, which I love that you term it that, the micro yeses, like it's a win. Like I feel like we set ourselves up for failure a lot of times, because even making the walk around the block after work to get us in that, if we don't, we're like, oh, I'm terrible. I might as well just eat the whole pantry and then not do it again.
Right.
Versus like, you know what? I can put the shoe by the front door, and then it's like a little micro like pat on the shoulder, and then the next day and the next day. So I mean, I love that. I mean, we teach our teams, and we have such this mindset of like success loves speed. And I feel like people don't realize like it takes those little, as you call them, micro yeses to get to that speed where, like you said, then you're out the door. Then you're like, here I come. How do you teach that to, like, now that you kind of have the hat on with your therapy, like, where do you start with somebody when they come to you and they're like, listen, I'm a hot mess express. Like, where do I start?
We always start with, and this question, again, really bothered me when it was asked to me because it put the ball in my court. And the question is, well, what are your choices? And so like if someone comes to me, not sure if they want to stay or leave a marriage, for example, like, do I stay or do I go is way too big of a question to start with, because I don't know what your choices are. If you have no kids, if you are independently wealthy and you're not financially dependent on your partner and you don't work together, that's going to tee up a lot of choices that are very different than if you're medically dependent, financially dependent, you have little children, and you both have built a business together where both of your families all depend on that income for their well-being. And so we don't start with what do I do? We start with what is the menu of options actually available to you? Often the phrase, I feel stuck, what that actually means is I am not a fan of any of these choices. I don't like any of them. I don't want to do any of them reasonably. But we don't start with the what do we do? And we definitely don't start with the why am I stuck? We always start with what are your choices? Because that's going to determine our next step. Always.
That is so good.
I feel like when I read something that you wrote and it's the whole like, why am I stuck? And correct me if I'm wrong, but it was kind of like, I don't have to know why I'm
Mhm.
stuck right now. And for some reason it like, I was like, you know what? It's so true for a lot of things that I think we're, especially being a mom and a business person and everything, it's like, got to figure it out. Got to figure out like why. But I loved it that you said, like, in my own words, like, you don't have to know. Like, we'll figure it out. Like, you don't have to have the reason why you're stuck. But I love that you just said, like, what are the menu of options?
Yeah,
Mhm.
because that determines everything. And the
Yeah.
why, it's so fun. So like I became a therapist because I was obsessed with why I was doing what I was doing and then why all the other humans were doing what they were doing. But even if you like even let's say you're stuck and you're with a procrastination, bedtime procrastination, you're up till 3 in the morning doom scrolling. Well, I can tell you why. It's likely it's because your life is really loud all day long and you want some alone time and some quiet time, and that revenge bedtime procrastination gives you some alone time. Great. Now you're still stuck. Having the insight doesn't create the transformation. And so start with why is really good business development advice. And you're both businesswomen, right? So,
Mhm.
Simon Sinek's work, Start with Why, is like the gold standard
Mhm.
of business development. And it's good for that. Start with why, yay, for your business. Start with why, yeah, no, for any type of personal stuckness. So why can't I stop the habit? Why can't I start the habit? Why do I do the same thing over and over again? These questions have an answer, but you don't need to know it to get yourself moving. Once momentum takes over, then we can ask why. But often, once people are feeling better and moving, they don't really care about why. It's like, I don't
Mhm.
care why I'm stuck. I want to get unstuck. And that's
Mhm.
what micro yeses get you on the path to doing.
How do you get to this place where you say, like you said, you couldn't find somebody to help you and to help you understand what it was you're going through? Did you hit a point in your life? Did something happen where you say, okay, enough is enough. I either need to start like looking inside, or how does that look? Because I'm thinking of people that you could have just kept
Mm.
going and kept going and kept going, and you're so bright and intelligent. Did something kind of turn the course for you?
Yeah, I think it was a compounding series of events. But when I tried to kind of pinpoint it, I think if I had kept going the way I was going, I would be dead. And I
Mm.
was really struggling so deeply with my CPTSD and PTSD. During my mid 20s, I would say I was around 24, 25. I had reached a point where I started really having suicidal thoughts. And those weren't unfamiliar to me. My first
Mhm.
thoughts of suicide, I was 11 years old. I was severely bullied and grew up in a house that was very dysfunctional with a narcissistic father who was very emotionally manipulative and abusive. And nowhere I could go was safe. It was like not at home,
Mm.
not at school. And so I've had those thoughts and had those thoughts for quite some time. But when I was in my early 20s, my cousin ended up taking her life. And she was somebody
Mm.
that I really, really looked up to, idolized. I didn't have really much of a relationship because she was older than me. She was 28 and I was like maybe like 19, 20 years old. And, she was off living her life, but she really struggled with bipolar disorder
Mm.
and drug and alcohol addiction. And I saw her go from being this straight A student, star in the musical theater of her high school, like, cool girl that I idolized, to really falling into deep, deep mental health problems. And she couldn't get the support and help that she needed. And she ended up checking out. And
Mm.
that was a pretty monumental moment in my life. And she was, I believe, 27 or 28 when she had done that. And I was probably like 19 years old, 18,
Mm.
19, 20, something like that. So when I reached around the same age that she was when she decided to take her life, I was in a very similar position. I was very addicted to marijuana. I was very, very addicted to alcohol. I was numbing everything out because all of life was just too intense for me to handle. And I went to therapy on and off since I had been 12 years old, but nobody really was trained in complex trauma. It wasn't anything that was researched at the time, or if so, very, very like few people really knew about it. The therapist I saw just didn't know what to do other than prescribe anxiety or depression medication that ended up just being kind of a crutch that helped me through, but didn't solve really the problems that were deeper underneath. So I did reach a point when I was like 25 years old where I felt like, okay, I'm having these suicidal thoughts and I actually have a desire to take action on them. And that scared me more than
Mhm.
anything in the entire world. And
Mhm.
at that point, I remember reaching a moment where I was sitting in my apartment feeling really lost, feeling, like, why am I even here? What's the point? Really starting to feel that desire to take my life. And some little voice came into my head. I can't really explain it, but it was this voice that was like, okay, listen, like maybe, yes, maybe it's easier if you check out, right? But let's not do that until we have literally explored everything you can possibly explore. And if there's no answers and no solution, then you can do that. But we
Mhm.
haven't. We haven't turned over every rock yet. What if you teach yourself about all of the things that you need to know to better understand what you're going through, and maybe you can do what you need to do to heal yourself instead of trying to find somebody to do it for you or to help you with that. And so I had this kind of idea and I was like, I'm going to make a huge life shift. Like, I'm going to give it one more go. Like, this is going to
Wow.
be the big push. And I went back to school and that completely changed my whole entire life. Everything made sense. Suddenly there was like research and science and knowledge that I could just, like, I was like, what? Like, oh my God, everything I went through, there's a reason I am the way I am. Like, it all makes sense. I'm not crazy. I'm not damaged. I'm not broken. And there are ways to move forward. And so that was really that shift, around that time in my life where I basically faced two choices. And I was like, I'm not going to give up just yet. I'm going to give it one more go. And I did. And that really changed everything.
But another question I do have about PTSD and the healing process for people. I want to get into what you do for them and how you help them and serve them. Is there like a forgiveness factor? Like, I think about your dad, your family, and the abuse you had at home.
Yeah.
Do you have a relationship with him, or did
Yeah.
you forgive him? Is that part of the process, or is
Yeah.
forgiveness part of it, or
Right.
do you just
Okay.
learn to, even if you can't forgive, do you like something about that? Maybe a response on
Yeah.
that.
So that's an interesting question, something I get very often. And, this isn't an opinion that I have just of, coming from me, but it also is based in all the knowledge that I have and the training that I have and what's been taught to me as well, from leaders in this field. The truth is, you don't need to forgive in order to heal. In fact, sometimes not forgiving the person is exactly what you need to do because
Mm.
that feels right for you. When it came to my father and kind of the situation, we've been no contact for more than 10 years. And that was something that I consciously chose to do because it was for my well being and there was really no moving around it. And when someone doesn't want to change and you've tried everything, at a certain point, it's like you're walking up to a brick wall and smashing your head on it and you keep doing it over and over, it's only hurting you. And so part of my experience with that has been giving myself compassion and permission to step away from that relationship, even though there's a lot of guilt and shame and all the things that come up when you decide to cut somebody out of your life, and grief, which we don't really talk about, the grief of kind of mourning somebody who is still alive. And it's a very difficult process and something that I revisit. Actually, I'm revisiting it now with my therapist, who I found, who's amazing, working on inner child stuff, which has been really magical. But oftentimes, when it comes to forgiveness, you do not need to forgive to move on and to heal. If someone did something to you, you do not need to forgive them for it. And you can, find understanding, compassion, whatever. But if forgiving doesn't feel right for you, don't do it because it could also re-traumatize you. So it really just depends on the individual and kind of how they feel around that.
I love that because I don't think I've ever heard that, to be honest. I mean, I feel like that I've always have been taught that, we always forgive and it's part of the journey. You don't have to forget, but you have to forgive. And what you're saying, it kind of rings true to me because I think, like you said, it doesn't mean you can't move forward. It doesn't mean you can't move on. And maybe forgiveness will come in the future. And I think that's what you're saying too, but it doesn't have to.
Yeah, exactly. Because ultimately, your job is not to forgive someone who hurt you. if
Mhm.
someone hurt you and they don't take responsibility for that hurt, or even if they do and it just doesn't, it's not enough for you, like that's
Mhm.
okay.
Mhm.
Your only responsibility is for you to give yourself compassion and love and forgiveness for
Mhm.
yourself if you feel like you need to forgive yourself.
Mhm.
That's important.
Yeah.
But you can rewire the brain and you can rewire the nervous system to help support you to move forward without
Mhm.
having to forgive anybody. And again, it's also about like what is best for you, right? So, does forgiveness feel good when you sit with it? Does it feel like something that really will help you and support you, or does it feel like you're betraying yourself, right? And really sitting with that will help you understand whether like which route to take, you know?
Mhm.
Oh, I think that's very powerful. We talk a lot
Yeah.
in our trainings and in what we do, our mentorship for different women on our teams and just in our life and in our book, I Decide, we talk about your circle of influence. And it's not as severe as some of the trauma and different situations of abuse that we're talking about today, but it can be. I mean, having the wrong people around you and feeling like you have to continuously forgive them for the way they act or for who they are or for the way they spend their day instead of just giving yourself that permission to move away from that situation. And so I absolutely love that concept. And
Yeah.
I feel like in my life too, I've been trained or taught, maybe is a better word, from my parents and the people that raised me, that you have to forgive. You have to forgive, or you're the one that suffers. But sometimes I think forgiving is, not doing the best thing for your own self. It's just doing what you think you should do.
Mhm.
So I
Yeah.
love that. I love that concept. So when people have a state or a level of PTSD from their past, how do they know? Like, how do you identify this in people? Because I feel like people go through their life and they might feel depressed, they might have suicidal thoughts, they might not know how to function very well, but they don't know that there's a deep rooted reason for it, and they don't know how to identify that. So how do you help people
Yeah.
identify those feelings?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first thing is if you're kind of on a self-healing journey and you don't have the funds to go to a therapist or you're curious about this, there's so many wonderful resources online to help you kind of understand whether or not you may or may not have PTSD. The DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that therapists use, and I'm trained as a traditional therapist. That was a field originally I was going to go into before moving into coaching. It's free. You can go online, you can look up the actual definition and criteria to diagnose PTSD. And the only person who really, I feel like you can get diagnosed for sure by a very well trained clinician, but you can also read these things for yourself and go, does that sound like me? Does that resonate? And when we're looking at what constitutes PTSD, there's certain elements that definitely are very, very particular to this diagnosis. So the first thing is chronic and severe, moderate to severe anxiety and depression, fear, things that, you can go through a moment of anxiety and it goes away, or you can have like a period of depression that's from one specific event. Let's say your dog, I love my dog, he passed away, your grandparent passes away and you're close with them. And it's based on that you go through kind of a depressive moment and then you're able to kind of grieve and heal and move forward. That's not necessarily PTSD. PTSD is very long lasting, and it's kind of like you have some low, middle to high resting level of anxiety or depression that does not seem to go away fully at any given time.
Mm.
It's just present constantly and goes, and it's not situation based. So it can come at any time for any reason and intensify because of triggers. That's the second thing. Do you find yourself triggered or emotionally activated, in a way that's disproportionate to what's happening right in front of you? So, for example, let's say I went through a really severe car accident in 20, maybe 2012, 2013. And that contributed to adding on to the PTSD I already had. But, you know, it's like the next time I would get into a car for many, many years, I would be so like, you know, like scared, like any car that would come near, I would have like almost near panic attacks.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so that's kind of like the emotional triggers that can come up, that can remind you of a situation or something that happened in the past, and it continues to come up unless it's addressed. And emotional flashbacks, same as triggers. So basically, you're kind of triggered into an emotional state from something in the present that is reminding you of that original trauma. Or psychological memory flashbacks. So you have memories flashing through your mind. It could be through nightmares. It could be just witnessing again a similar event that reminds you of that traumatic experience. Those are all different kind of hallmark examples of potential PTSD. And so, yeah, so those are some things. And also, you know, it can lead to potentially like, and this is more on the like integrative medicine side. So what I find very annoying and ironic is that, you know, you learn psychology, but unless you go to a very specific school, they don't tie in with other medicines unless you learn all of those different medicines. So this is why I have so much training in these areas, because I was very curious. But PTSD also causes a lot of health issues. It can cause severe disease and illness like cancer to come up. It can cause IBS, intestinal issues, digestive issues, chronic illness, fibromyalgia, basically a whole plethora of physical experiences that are based on your genetics. So let's say you're predisposed to have certain diseases or certain health issues, asthma, you know, diabetes, things like that. PTSD can actually be the thing that triggers, like the switch of the light that activates those genetic components through stress, chemicals and hormones that flood your body from these traumatic experiences that never go away. And then suddenly you have a plethora of health issues that you never had before. And so if you like go online and you can kind of do some research on your own, if you're curious, if you're struggling with something like fibromyalgia or mystery pain, chronic illness, something like this, it may or may not be related to a traumatic experience that you had in the past and how that has affected you chemically in your body, and then how that's broken down your tissues and your cells and things and left you susceptible to some of these diseases and you know, things that can be really complicated and painful. So it's quite complex, but at the same time, you know, these are kind of the hallmark things that I would look for. And again, like if you the simplest way to kind of start the journey of understanding if you have PTSD or not is to ask yourself a simple question. Did I experience a one-time, very intense, overwhelming experience that knocked me on my ass? And to use my language, I don't know if I can say that.
Yeah, you can.
Really knocked me on my ass that I have not been able to fully recover from. And I feel like it still affects me to this day. And that is really, that's honestly, like, if we were to boil it all down, like, that's the question that you can ask yourself, you know?
Yeah.
And generally that'll be like, yeah, that's criteria for PTSD.
Okay, I'm not gonna lie, I'm totally nerding out at all of this because my major was clinical psychology, and like the DSM-5, I was like, she just said the DSM-5. So I love all of this, but I love that you've taken a step further, you know, that I mean, it's not, there's so much you can learn from going that psychological route, but like you said, there's so much more to it. And I love that you've given us the answer of like, because that's what Lisa and I were talking about this earlier, like, where do you start? You know, like, where do you start with the self-healing process? And, you know, you have the ability now to help others in that process. But like, what's something we can do at home? So like, if we're listening to this and things that you're saying are kind of maybe triggering some emotions or some thoughts that we're having, like, one, we know that they can use you online, correct? We don't have to fly
Yes.
to France, even though I would love to.
Yep.
Yes, but we can't. Maybe we should have a retreat or something. But like, what's something that people can do at home to like start that self-healing process as you might be triggering some thoughts and emotions? Because I think you're like hitting something with some people probably.
Oh man, I hope so. And if you're out there, like, and something is resonating here and you feel like you're getting an answer to something you've been wondering for yourself, like, I really hope you give yourself permission to explore all of this for yourself because it's so life changing. Absolutely. I'm a big believer in we are our best healers. If you have, from my own experience, if you have the knowledge and the kind of ability to show up for yourself and create a container for yourself, it's a great place to start. And also, not everybody has financial access to people who have this kind of knowledge, and it's not really something that is taught in traditional school for
Yeah.
therapists. You have to really go to a specialized place, and there are very few that really teach a lot of this stuff, specifically trauma related. But a couple of things. So when you experience trauma, it affects you on I'd like to say two different, three major levels. It kind of depends. So the two biggest ones is that your brain is deeply affected and your nervous system is deeply affected. These are two things that you can begin healing on your own without anybody's help, and also without digging into your trauma and reliving everything, which, by the way, many times only reinforces neural connections and nervous system responses that have been present for you for a long time. Makes it worse. It amplifies it. Talking about your trauma makes you relive it. Your brain cannot tell the difference between fantasy and reality. And so it feels like it's reliving the trauma in real time all over again. So talking about it isn't necessarily going to be helpful. Is it helpful with a professional to actually have a witness to your pain and to help you untangle some of this by talking about it? For sure. But that only goes so far. Creating meaning and awareness around your experience is very important. But you also need to address fundamentally how it's damaged the brain and how it's damaged the body. With trauma, there are specific areas of the brain where they've done brain scans where essentially you have injuries. And so there's your amygdala, there's your hippocampus, there's your prefrontal cortex, there's your limbic system. These are all parts of your brain that control emotional regulation, memory storage, executive functioning, like being able to make conscious choices and decisions, you be able to think clearly and logically. They're all places that have been injured. And there are a bunch of different neural connections that have been made that have basically programmed your brain to be in a fight or flight mode pretty much all the time, whether you really feel it or are conscious of it or not. And so one of the things that you can begin doing to start healing these brain injuries is very, very simple. Mindfulness meditation. I know it sounds like hoo-ha, woo-hoo, woo-woo, whatever. For me, when I first heard about it, I'm a science girly, so I was like, how is like sitting going to do anything? Well, it actually helps you grow gray matter in those parts of the brain to build them back up. They're not going to be shrunken, which means that when they're shrunken or there's holes in those parts of your brain, you experience like tremendous anxiety, tremendous depression, ruminating thoughts, obsessive compulsive thoughts, really negatively programmed mindset stuff, stuff that really wears you down after a long time. And so when you do mindfulness meditation and you learn how to like safely in your body bear witness to your own thoughts and your own consciousness, you're actually building neural connections to help the alarm systems of your brain start to reprogram to feel safer. It reprograms the memory storage to start wiping out some of the more negative things. And it just literally is like sending construction workers into the injured parts of your brain to help build them back up. So like self-compassion, gratitude, mindfulness meditation, being able to do that for your brain is incredibly powerful. And I want you to think of it as like going to the gym for your brain. Like these practices, doing them regularly are going to rebuild your brain so you feel happier, more confident, more safe, more empowered, like all the good things. And all of that is really, this is the start. You do it that way. The other thing you can do at home is really tend to your nervous system. So your nervous system is there to communicate from your brain to the rest of your body, all your muscles, your organs, your tissues. It's like you're going to laugh so hard. I have the nervous system tattooed on my arm.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so if you can see here, it's actually these long tendrils of nerve endings that are, they run from your brain all the way through your body. So you have your throat, you have your chest, your heart space, your lungs, your stomach, and then you have down here by your root, your hips, your butt, your pelvis, all of this. These are all built in as survival mechanisms to sense danger at any given point in your human experience and get you away from it as quickly as possible. When you have trauma, you have a dysregulated nervous system, because it's like, imagine, there's a lion and you're in the wilderness and you are hunting and a lion chases you and bites you and all of this. Your nervous system is trained to never forget that, so that you never experience it again. And with PTSD, it's very similar. You go through a traumatic experience and now your nervous system is all dysregulated, on high alert, hypersensitive, and it also leads to feeling depressed, anxious, having chronic health issues or severe health issues. And you can actually tend to your nervous system to help bring it out of this fight or flight, this chronic fight or flight, and come back into a state of rest and digest, which is when we feel safe, connected, open, that gushy, mushy feeling, when you just feel so good. That's when your nervous system is really in a grounded, regulated place. When it's dysregulated, you're flooding your body with things like norepinephrine, adrenaline, cortisol. And when you have all three of these stress hormones flooding your body constantly, because you're on hyper alert for any potential threat, it breaks you down mentally and it breaks you down physically. So you want to live longer, you want to look younger, you want to feel better. Let's kind of unstick your nervous system. So there are many ways you can do this. It's literally like, you want to think about gently shaking out your nerves. So you could do breath work. Whether it's quick paced breath work like breath of fire, or it's slow paced breath work like alternate nostril breathing, pranayama, yoga practices, doing actual yoga. It's wonderful for helping reset the nervous system and regulate. Learning how to sit in stillness and breathe, just letting yourself breathe with a full belly, like that's going to be helpful. Dancing, shaking, hiking, exercise, anything moving your body is going to help you regulate. I know a lot of people actually who are like, oh man, I feel so much better after I go to the gym and I lift weights or I run. That's because you're actually helping your nervous system shake off the stress, and then it's resetting. So if you do this and you engage in de-stressing your body in whatever way feels good for you, moving the body, also getting massages, some kind of physical touch, co-regulating with a calm, engaged, grounded other person, whatever feels good for you to shake off that stress and to like engage in the physicality of things, that's going to really help retrain your body to feel safe and your nervous system to come out of this state of chronic stress. So you can kind of approach this neurologically, you can approach it physically, and then if you're spirituality always brings in a nice element of feeling some kind of purpose or meaning to your experience, or having a higher power of some kind that you feel like you can communicate with or share things with, never a bad thing. Is it necessary? No, but it's like another thing you can kind of, if it resonates, you can definitely lean on to help you start to work on all of this stuff. But you don't have to pay a lot of money for an expensive professional to really address the brain injury and the body injury that happens from PTSD. You just have to kind of lean into somatic practices and subconscious work, and then you can kind of do a majority of the heavy lifting really, yourself.
So you were raised in New York City, and did you have a rough upbringing?
I wouldn't say it was rough, but I was bullied as a child and I was a very highly sensitive child.
Mhm.
So being bullied did not work well with my personality.
Mm.
And that really shaped my self esteem. It made me feel ostracized. It made me feel unloved. It made me feel like I struggled to belong as a child because it happened very early on in life. I would say it started around first grade and it was throughout all of elementary school that I was experiencing bullying. And I experienced bullying for things that did make me different. So I'm 5'10" and I was always tall. So I was always the tallest kid in my class. And so people teased me for that. And I also recognized that I was the tallest, for example. So I thought something was wrong with me. People teased me for a variety of things that I just didn't have the tools or the language to understand children are being children.
Mhm.
And I just didn't understand how to cope with a lot of those things. And so in my household, my parents are from Panama. And I think that cultural difference as well, they perceived mental health as, something that was related to drug abuse or homelessness. They
Mm.
didn't fully understand anxiety. So when I would talk about the bullying, they did their best to give me a pep talk, but it also felt a little dismissive. And again, I was a highly sensitive child. So I
Mhm.
don't necessarily feel like they had the language to give me the
Mhm.
coping skills and techniques that I needed as a kid, which left me feeling quite alone in my
Mhm.
family system as well.
Mhm. It would be very isolating.
Very. It
Yes.
was.
Yeah. My heart goes out to that for a lot of people. And I do feel so grateful for people like you, Mina, who have opened the conversation and are, with your podcast and all the different things that you do to really, really talk about it, because I have many people in my life that felt the same isolation because their families weren't taught how to talk about it, and they didn't understand it, and it wasn't their fault. They just didn't know. They didn't know what they didn't know, and so they couldn't help their child. And now that child has PTSD and trauma from it.
Well, and I think that, like you said, Lisa, it's parenting hardest job in the world, and we don't know what we don't know. And I love that now we live in this world where I think it's almost heightened because of social media and, everything. And so, Mina, like the path that you're taking of allowing these conversations and giving parents the tools to have those conversations, absolutely doing that. So is this something that like first of all, I want to point out too, that I think when we find our passion and turn it into our purpose, like that to me is something that the fact that you were able to recognize that and say that, this is something that I'm experiencing and then turn it into a career,
Mhm.
then it doesn't feel like a job. It's our
Yeah.
purpose in life. And I'm assuming that's probably how you feel.
Oh, yes, absolutely. It definitely feels like there's a lot of meaning to what I
Mhm.
Mhm.
do because of my experiences, and I know the impact it's
Mhm.
having. And so I am very grateful. I
Mhm.
think about it all the time that I get to do
Mhm.
the thing that I really, really love
Yeah.
and is meaningful to me. And like you said, it's rooted in my purpose. And I'm
Mhm.
really happy that I get to
Mhm.
do this work.
Mhm.
Can I tell you on a side note, I am 6 feet tall and I was 5'11" in fifth grade.
Mm.
And that is like a giant in the fifth grade. And I was so self conscious because I was ruthlessly teased. And I fully understand that feeling. And, my parents would make light of it. And it wasn't bullying. It was definitely, I was just being teased for my height. But to this day, when I talk to anybody about my size, I always say, oh, yeah, I'm a giant. I come out like my first instinct is to make it very negative because that's the
Mhm.
way I felt about it as a child. When actually I feel very blessed to be tall. I feel blessed to be healthy every single day, and I don't take that for granted. But I have that in my head because of that teasing. And so when you were talking about the height, I was like, oh, we had the same deal when it comes to that. So I just had to
Thank
share that.
you.
People don't know how tall I am on Zoom because I just look like I'm normal. But when I stand up, I'm 6 feet tall, and put any shoes on, I'm 6'2". So
It is
Same.
funny when we meet people, they're like, oh, she's tall. And I'm no small drink of water either, but
you are a small drink of water, but you're tall as
I'm
well.
tall. I'm
Yeah.
tall. I have two teenagers, that's a whole different podcast in itself. But having teenagers, it's a constant, kids are mean, people are mean, let's be honest. But they also it's a defense mechanism, I think, for a lot of people. So I mean, I'm curious for selfish reasons, like, I know you have clients and it's a different world now that like what tools do you give people to understand that it's kind of, maybe a terrible analogy, but like when a boy picks on you and he picked, this and that and everything, I remember my mom always teaching me too, like he probably likes you, because they don't know how to react. Like we're not given the tools. And I loved diving into your podcast because you not only are helping people, but I think all of us love practical tools that you can give us, for somebody listening too that are saying, you know what, like I do maybe get picked on or bullied. Like, are there things that popped to your head about tools that you've taken on yourself, but like tools that you help others when we face things like this?
Yeah, I think that there's numerous things. First, I like to work with parents and honestly just
Mm,
people related to our conditioning and our biases when it comes to gender and the stereotypes that we have around that. Because it's even interesting, as Lisa was pointing out, like with your height, like you perceive your height as a negative, but men are not taught to perceive their height as a negative thing. And so women, when we're told that that is not normal. We're told that's not sexy. We're told that something is wrong. So therefore we can lead with this negative ideology of who we are.
you said something that I'm curious, toxic positivity.
Mm.
Explain that, because I was like, toxic positivity.
Yes. So toxic positivity pretty much is when we utilize positive euphemisms or we engage in positive ideologies to dismiss feelings of discomfort. And so a lot of the times we might hear quotes like everything happens for a reason because we have a really hard time grappling with reality or sitting with grief. Another thing that you might hear people, especially if they come from a religious background, they might say, oh, God won't give you anything that you can't handle. And the person is like, well, I can't handle this right now. So I need something else, right? Like, this is actually hard and I don't know how to handle it. And so that phrase is not really helping me. And so what happens is, it goes back to what I shared earlier. Often, when I find the reason why people engage in toxic positivity is again, discomfort is hard for everyone. And so, if you come to me with something that is deep, heavy, and just filled and riddled with grief and sadness, I now have to figure out how to sit and sort through those emotions that I probably spent a lot of time running away from in my own personal life. Now you want me to sit with it with you, but I don't even sit with that feeling myself. And so if I don't know how to sit with my own grief, it might be really hard for me to sit with you in your own grief. And so it's easier for us to just find positive solutions to everything and slap it on every circumstance instead of owning that this is hard. Some things in life are hard. Some things in life are uncomfortable. Some things in life make us very angry. Some things in life cause us deep pain and it leaves wounds. And until we sit with that and acknowledge it, we're not going to give ourselves the ability to heal because healing requires us to face the truth about what we're experiencing, but also about what we're feeling. And if we keep denying and dismissing those emotions, trying to get to the finish line, then we're never going to have the tools we need to be resilient or to cope when hardship and adversity does arise. And often, when we're going through hard things, we just want positivity to be at our doorstep immediately instead of figuring out while I'm in my state of grief, what does it look like for me to mourn something? What does it look like for me to sit in this deep sadness? And how can I also focus on developing community and deepening my relationships with people in the midst of this hardship? Because even in hardship, I can still develop close bonds with someone, And so, and I can also develop a deeper bond with myself because I can recognize things that I have the ability to overcome. And I can also recognize certain truths that I didn't even realize existed. And that's why this loss is so painful to me because it's opening up something to me to help me recognize, maybe that person or that relationship or that job opportunity, it was meaningful to me. And that's letting me see that this loss hurts me so much because this thing was actually so meaningful to me. And now I have to sit in this and I have to rest in it and I have to embrace it. And by doing so, I can finally get to a place of acceptance of that it happened and also figure out how to move forward.
You've been listening to the I Decide Darlings podcast. If this podcast touched your heart, please share it with your friends and family right after you subscribe yourself.
Don't forget to head over to iDecideBook.com and grab a copy of our favorite book and daily journal. As always, thank you for being here, and we can't wait for you to hear our next episode.